So now what we're going to do is go through each of the individual subject area. I have some adaptations and accommodations for each subject area, and then links to lessons for each area. So in art, the adaptations first is tools and supplies, and this is something that's ever changing. It's an area where there are always all the time new products coming out and new things to use. Something that I've used a few things this year with students who had sensory needs. A few of them didn't like the sound and feel of a crayon coloring in. Like that scratchy sound was just made them uncomfortable. It distracted them and made them unable to work. So I bought some gel crayons, and some students I gave them their own set of gel crayons, and then I also have a couple of sets of gel crayons in my classroom. And these are a type of crayon that colors. It's very smooth and slick and smooth, and it doesn't give that scratchy sound, and it doesn't give that scratchy input, that vibration in your hand when you're using those things. That being said, that scratchiness is good for sensory input and building recall and building memory. So if you can work your way from the gel crayons into using regular crayons, it is really, really good for children to get that sensory input, because it helps build their brain and helps build their memory and recall. Even pencils, I have some students who have a hard time with pencils. That scratchiness is just puts them into sensory overload, and so they prefer to use erasable pens, which is perfectly fine with me. There are times where I ask those students to try to use a pencil, and I might give them a smoother piece of paper so the pencil doesn't make that scratchy sound or input. But again, I do want them to have some opportunities of at least trying that scratchy pencil or that scratchy crayon, just so they can just have just a little bit, even just a little bit of exposure, not forcing them to use it for the whole project, not forcing them to do anything really, but giving them an opportunity to try it. And if they say no, or if they say I'm just not comfortable with it, or it's too scratchy, or it's too much, then it's too scratchy and it's too much, and they don't do it that time. But I do present them the opportunity to try it again other times. Other art supplies that are specific to students with special needs. One is cups that are lower profile for paint and water, so that the child is not having to lift their arm so high to get it into the paint or get it into the water. So lower profile makes it easier for them to access that material that they need to get back to their paper. Something else is sometimes holding the paper while they're drawing or while they are manipulating their paper. It is important for them to hold their paper, again, for that spatial awareness and knowing where their paper is and where their marks on their paper need to be. But sometimes the physical work of holding the paper and painting or drawing on it at the same time is too much. And so sometimes holding the paper is the important task, and spatial awareness of being aware of where the paper is on the table. Sometimes that's important, so I want them to hold it. But then sometimes it's more important for them to get those marks on the paper and to use whatever that material is. So maybe it's the time they're trying to use that scratchy crayon. Well, I don't want them to be distracted on trying to focus on holding their paper and trying to work through the sensory input of using that scratchy crayon. So I might tape their paper for them and eliminate that sensory piece for that time, to give them the opportunity to focus on a different sensory aspect or different even cognitive aspect of what they need to be working on in that moment. And it might change from time to time. Adaptive scissors are also great. There's all different kinds of adaptive scissors, and I actually have got several at Walmart this year. Some are spring loaded, so you use them like this. Some have loops in them that the children almost like use a pincher grasp to use them. Some are a push button, like the old school staplers that had the knob on it that you could push through a big binder. So there are just so many options out there for our kiddos. Even paintbrushes in my classroom, I don't have adaptive paintbrushes, but I have tons of sizes and tons of varieties. And so sitting at one table, the kids might be using 6 different kinds of brushes because each of them has different needs and has what works for them. And that's Gen Ed and EC classes where that happens. Having secondary activities available, preferably usually a preferred task. This usually works really well for me, not only if a child with special needs has finished up something early or super fast, and they don't want to go back and revisit it. They don't want to go back and work on it more because once they finish it, they've checked it off as complete and they're ready to move on, and that's okay. Let it moving on from that. But having a secondary task available for them is super important, and always having it ready so you're not necessarily scrambling trying to come up with something in that moment. So some examples of secondary activities I have in my classroom is I have dry erase boards and dry erase markers if they want to draw on there. I do have free draw paper if they want to draw. I have art apps on the iPad if they want to do digital art apps, or if they want to read a book, then they can read a book. And sometimes they just want to go lay on the carpet. And if they want to go lay on the carpet, they can go lay on the carpet as long as they have done that task I've asked them to do first. They have to do the work first before they get to do the secondary activity. But having that secondary activity is important. And that's all of my students with special needs, whether they are the mainstream, self-contained, or inclusion settings. But sometimes that secondary activity is also a good motivator to get through the non-preferred task. Like if they don't want to do the work I'm asking them to do and that the rest of the class is doing, that secondary activity is good motivation for them to get through the non-preferred task so that they can get to the preferred task. Student choice is important, and I think student choice is important for every student, but especially for children who don't have as much control over their lives. So students with special needs, they don't always get to choose they don't even get to choose their words if they don't have words to give to you, or they don't get to choose their movements if they can't walk and their body doesn't move the way their brain wants it to, or they don't get to choose their lunch because they have such a limited diet. Allowing them any kind of choice with their paper. And the choice can be simple. It can be, do you want to use a red crayon or an orange crayon? Do you want to use a white paper or blue paper? Do you want to stand up or sit down? Do you want to write your name first or draw your picture first? Any time you can give children with special needs a choice, no matter how big or small, give them an opportunity to make a choice and to build confidence and have a chance to be successful. But just know the choices you give them, you have to be okay with their choice. So if you tell them choose a red crayon or orange crayon, but they need to choose red, then that's not a choice, but they choose orange. You have to be okay with them choosing orange. But, like if you want them to choose red, you might say, do you want this red crayon or this red crayon? And let them choose which red crayon they want. And then they have still made a choice. They still feel empowered that they are in control of that crayon and that drawing. But at the same time, they're still doing what it is you need for them to do. But just when you give them choices, you've got to give them choices that you can work with. All right, so some lesson ideas. I have some links here for you that I'm going to pull up, and hopefully, no, that did not. Let me see if I can go back here. I'm going to come back and do a recording of the links.